Hey, welcome KidMotion kids and families and anybody else who might be joining us for our session 2 of our Bible walk. So we talked about that the Bible is God's epic story. And if we really want to understand who God is, we want to learn to follow God more and know all about Jesus, we need to understand the whole story of the Bible. And so we're walking through the Old Testament. So our first session, we got halfway through the Old Testament using key words that start with the letter C and motions for all of those, and we learned kind of the map. So let's review the map real quick. You can say them out loud with me, all right? One, you got to participate, you got to say things out loud, do the motions, and you got to have fun, all right? So here we go. This was Italy, Macedonia, Asia, Judah, Egypt. This is the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile River, the Red Sea. This is the Persian Gulf. The top river's the Tigris, the bottom river's the Euphrates. This is the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. All right, so let's review what we learned in session 1, and then we'll start with the second half of the Old Testament for session 2. So we got creation, conscience, cursed, covenant, confusion, call. Who got the call? Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah. That brought them to Canaan. There they had children. Their children ended up carrying because they were slaves. All right? And in Egypt, there was a contest between who? God and Pharaoh. How many plagues? 10 plagues. But the Israelites were covered. Okay? So finally, Pharaoh said, I'm going to let God's people go. And so all of the Israelites packed their stuff up, and even some Egyptians went with them, and they started their way, the journey to leave Egypt, until they got right there to a part of the Red Sea. So they got to this Red Sea. Now you got to understand, this is 600,000 men. That's how many people. So that's 2.5 to 3 million people when you start counting women and children who are leaving Egypt. And they get to the Red Sea, and they've got to get across. And it's about the time they get the Red Sea that Pharaoh changes his mind, and he sends his army after Moses and God's people. And then they can see off in the distance, they can see the dust cloud of the chariots coming. And so they've got to cross the Red Sea. So again, God does an incredible miracle, and he parts the Red Sea, and the water just stands up like walls. And God's people in Israel, they just walked right through. Okay, walked right through. And when the Egyptians got there, they started to come in, and God closed the waters down, and he drowned the Egyptian army. Now, I bet this summer you're going to the pool, you're going to the beach, you're going to the lake. Have you ever kind of smacked the water, and smacked your back or hit kind of hard, and it kind of makes that smack sound? Well, we're going to do that, and for our next C word, we're going to say crossing, okay? So we're going to smack the water and then make like the walls of the water, okay? So crossing. What is that? Crossing. So they were covered, and then they went to the crossing. So we got covered and then crossing, okay? So they wandered on out, started on their mission to get to the promised land. That's where God's going to take them until they came out here. And they came to a massive mountain called Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai. And this cool thing is happening as they're journeying through the wilderness. During the day, God's leading them by a cloud, and at night, he leads them by a pillar of fire. So God is with them. He has brought them out of Egypt. He's leading the way, and they get to the Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up to spend some time with God. And he spends some time with God, and when he comes down, he has something very special. Do you know what it is? The 10 Commandments. Right, so here's what we're going to do. Commandments. We're going to say, so we're going to make like a mount, and then we're coming down, and we're going to do like the commandments, okay? So we're going to say commandments. Can you do that? Commandments. So we got covered, crossing, commandments. So God gave his people 10 commandments to kind of obey and follow. Number 1 was, do not have any gods before me. Number 2, don't make an idol for yourself. Okay, you can't worship any other idols. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Don't use God's name as a curse word. All right. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So the seventh day, Sabbath day, rest. That's what God did. We're supposed to do the same thing. Honor your father and mother. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't lie. And don't be jealous of other people's things. 10 commandments. Now, here's the cool thing about the 10 commandments. 4 of those are about man to God, like how we deal with God. But 6 of them are man to man, how we deal with each other, people to people. So God cares about our relationship with him, but God also cares about our relationship with each other. In fact, later in the New Testament, when Jesus comes, he just narrows the 10 commandments down into 2. He says we love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and we love our neighbor as ourselves. So God's commandments were about this and about this, okay? So he gave us 10 commandments. How many were man to God? 4. And how many are man to man? 6. Okay, so that's going to be an important number. So covered, crossing, and then commandments. How many commandments? 10. How many are man to God? 4. How many are man to man? 6. Okay, you got that? That's going to be important. Let's go all the way to there. Creation, conscience, cursed, covenant, confusion, call. Who got the call? Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah. That brought them to Canaan. There they ended up having children because they were slaves and they started carrying, right? And there was a contest between God and Pharaoh. How many plagues? 10, but they were covered, and then they crossed and then got the commandments. How many commandments? 10. How many God to man? 4. How many man to man? 6. Right, good, okay. So we got the commandments. So they're out here in the wilderness, and they get the commandments, and they're going to do some more of their journeying, okay? And then they're going to camp, all right? They're traveling. They have to. Anybody ever gone camping in a tent? Yeah, they're going to camp. So we're just going to take our hands like this, okay? And actually, we're going to do like this. It's a dactylogical sign for camping. And you hold one still, and you kind of pop like that, and you say, camp, okay? So they'd set up these tents every night when they needed to. Again, they're following the cloud by day, the fire by night. God's taking care of them. He delivered them. And so now they're going to camp, all right? And when they camped, it was cool. They did all their tents, but they also did one really big tent. And they'd camp around it, and they'd put this big tent in the middle, and it was called the tabernacle. And that was kind of like their church building. It was their reminder that the presence of God was with them, okay? So we're going to say camp. So we got covered, crossing, commandments. How many commandments? 10. How many man to God? 4. How many man to man? 6. And then they camped, okay? So while they're camping, they decided, you know what? A bunch of us left from Egypt. We need to count each other. Okay, we're going to count each other. So we're going to take our hands together, kind of like we're pointing, like 1, 2, 3, and we're going to say counting. Can you do that? Counting. So it's camp and then counting. And so what they did was they divided themselves into 12 tribes. 12 tribes. So all the people were part of 12 tribes. So then that was how they camped, and that's how they marched, how they traveled. So when they camped, they put the tabernacle in the middle, and each tribe had an area around the tabernacle. When they walked and journeyed together, they did it in their tribes. And that's how they kind of knew and kept track of everybody, because they did the counting. So we got camp and then counting, all right? Well, what's cool is what comes next. Is now it's time to go. Where they're going is here. Remember? That's where Abraham was sent by God years ago. This was to be God's land, his people. And so they've got to get back there. And so Moses is going to send some spies in to check out Canaan, because they haven't been there for a long, long, long time. And so he sends these spies in. He sends a spy from each tribe. So how many spies would that be? 12 spies. And so they go in, they check it out. I mean, this is beautiful land. In fact, the Bible says it was flowing with milk and honey. So think of your favorite snack and your favorite drink. Like for me, it would be like flowing with Coke and ice cream. I mean, that's what I would love, right? I mean, or Mountain Dew and Swiss cake rolls, you know what I mean? Or whatever it is, your favorites. This was beautiful, but there were now nations that were living in there, and they were giants. So when the spies came back, 10 of the spies said, it's beautiful, but we can't go in there. We can't defeat those giants. But 2 of the spies were named Caleb and Joshua. And they were like, hey, this is the promised land. God delivered us. God has led us. God's going to take us in there. It's all part of God's plan, so we need to go. But guess who they listened to? Not Caleb and Joshua. They listened to the other 10 spies. So the people got scared and didn't think they could go in. So for spies, we're going to do like we got our binoculars on, and we're going to say Caleb and Joshua. Can you do that? Caleb and Joshua. Because 2 of them said, we can do it. But 10 said, no, we can't. We're scared. So we got covered, crossing, commandments, camp, counting, and Caleb and Joshua. All right, we're going to go back. We're going to do all the way to there. You ready? Here we go. Creation, conscience, cursed, covenant, confusion, call. Who got the call? Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah. That brought them to Canaan. There they had children, but their children ended up carrying because they were slaves. There was a contest between who? God, Pharaoh. How many plagues? 10 plagues, but they were covered, and then they crossed, and Moses got the commandments. How many commandments? 10. How many man to God? 4. How many man to man? 6. Then they were counted, or no, then they camped, right? They camped. Then they were counted. How many tribes? 12. 12 tribes. And then there were 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua. So we got camp, counting. How many tribes? 12. And then Caleb and Joshua. Well, remember I said that they didn't listen to Caleb and Joshua. They didn't. They listened to the other 10 and they got scared. So as a punishment, God said, I'm not going to let you into the promised land yet. And so what God had them do was they wandered in this area for 40 years. They just wandered around. Now, remember I told you that they had about 2.5 to 3 million people when they left Egypt? If they would have made a single file line, they could have made a single file line all the way to the promised land and back. That's how easy it was. But because they disobeyed God, the God who delivered them, the God who led them, the God who took care of them, they didn't believe that he could take care of these other people in the promised land. They listened to the 10 spies. Their punishment was they wandered, and they wandered out here for 40 years. So what God allowed to happen was the people who doubted, they died off. And God said, I'm going to start with a new generation. So after 40 years of wandering, they're finally ready to go into the promised land. Okay? So God led them up right here in front of the Jordan River. And Moses looked down into the promised land, and Moses was getting old. In fact, Moses was about to die. Moses wasn't going to be able to go into the promised land because he was going to die. And so Moses gave his last kind of message to them. He gave them his counsel. So we're going to take our rod like we got Moses and kind of serious, and he's going to go, counsel. Can you do that? Counsel. So we got covered, crossing, commandments. How many commandments? 10. How many man to God? 4. How many man to man? 6. Then they camped and they were counted. How many tribes? 12. 2 spies were Caleb, Joshua, and then Moses gave his counsel. All right, so Moses gave his counsel. Moses dies, and guess who becomes their leader? Joshua, one of the spies. Joshua's this great leader. He takes them into the promised land, and they go one of the first cities they come upon is a city called Jericho with the walls, and they marched around, and the people in Jericho probably thought, they're crazy, they're not attacking us, they're just marching around. On the 7th day, they marched around 7 times, then they blew trumpets, and God made the walls fall. And they captured Jericho, and they went on in, they captured city after city after city because God was with them, and it was God's plan and God's promised land for them. And so after we give the counsel, we're going to take this we're bringing the fist down, we're going to say conquest. So Joshua led the conquest. Moses gave the counsel, and Joshua led the conquest. Moses gave the counsel, Joshua led the All right, let's go all the way there. Here we go. Creation, conscience, cursed, covenant, confusion, call, Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah. That brought them to Canaan. There they had children. Their children ended up carrying. There was a contest between God, Pharaoh. How many plagues? 10, but they were covered. Then they crossed. Moses got the commandments. How many commandments? 10. How many man to God? 4. How many man to man? 6, right? All right. Then they camped and they were counted how many tribes? 12. 2 spies were Caleb, Joshua. Moses gave his counsel, and Joshua led the conquest. All right, conquest. Well, things are going great. They're going into the promised land. They're taking it over. They're starting to live. This is the plan God had, and they're designing that. But God's people often do what we do. We kind of go in cycles where we follow God and we don't follow God. We follow God and we don't follow God. And so we just go in these circles. And that's exactly what happened to them. They just started going around and around and around and around and around and around. They just started going in circles. And so it was these cycles. And so after conquest, we're going to go cycles. Can you do that? Conquest and then cycles, where they follow God and didn't follow God. And they started asking God for a king. And God's like, I don't want to give you a king. I don't want a person to have that much power. What if I give you some judges? And so when you read during the Bible, there's some awesome stories of some of these judges who just did incredible things. But I want to just tell you about 3 of my favorite judges, okay? The first judge, so this is during the cycles, okay? The judges were just people, they would kind of take care of things, lead the people, give God's messages, help people make wise decisions. Well, one of those judges was Deborah. And Deborah was a babe. I mean, she was beautiful. And she was a prophetess, and she was a songwriter, and she led armies into battle, but she was an awesome judge. And so for Deborah, we're just going to like this kind of really pretty voice, and with our hair, we're just going to go, Deborah. Okay, can you do that? Deborah. All right. What is it? Deborah. All right. And so then the second judge was a guy named Gideon. And Gideon was a great warrior. And one time he defeated a whole army with just 300 men. And another thing he did is he wanted God to say, hey, God, really show me that you're doing what you're going to do. And you're saying what you're going to say. And you're going to do the things you're going to do. And so he had a wool skin, a sheep's wool. And he said, have you ever left a towel out or some swimming trunks overnight or a shirt or something, and the dew in the grass gets it wet because there's dew in the morning? Well, Gideon set his sheep wool out, and he said, okay, God, tonight I want the dew to come, but I want my sheep's wool to be dry. And so he'd pick it up, and sure enough. And it goes, okay, one more thing, God. Tomorrow I want the ground to be dry, and I want my sheep's wool to be wet. So he gets up in the morning and wrings it out, okay? And sure enough, God was showing, yeah, I'm going to do what I'm going to say I'm going to do. So we've got Deborah. And our second, we're just going to take like we're wringing out a towel and say Gideon, okay? And then my third one of my favorites is Samson. And Samson was a Nazirite, and he made a vow. And his vow was, I can't have any wine or alcohol. I can't touch dead things. And I can't shave my head. And so Samson was known as, man, he was the man. He was strong. He was so strong and built. And so he defeated armies by himself. But he was one that went in cycles too, because he would disobey God. One time, guess what? He touched a dead thing. He got the skull of like an ox, and he defeated 1,000 Philistines with it. Another time, he got the Philistines, he tied torches to the foxtails, and they ran through all their fields and burned up all their fields. I mean, Samson's a pretty incredible story, but the one thing he was not supposed to do was cut his hair. That was the source of his strength. Well, it's actually God, but God said, don't cut your hair. And so Delilah was a woman, she finally kind of tempted him and got him to cut his hair, and the Philistines came, and they got him while he was weak, and they put him in prison, and they put him down in a mill. And he was just supposed to push this mill, and they gouged his eyes out. And so Samson lived down there for years, but his hair grew back. And he prayed to God, said, God, would you give me one last time to serve you for your people? And the Philistines were having this big party, and everybody who was important was there. And they brought Samson up, and they tied him between 2 pillars, and they wanted to make fun of him because for years Samson had just destroyed them. But they brought him up to make fun of him, and Samson prayed, God, give me one last time of strength. And Samson pushed the pillars down, and this great hall caved in and killed all the Philistine leaders. And so for Samson, we're gonna get strong. What do you like to do it like this or like this? We're just gonna say Samson, all right? So we got Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. Okay? So that's during the cycles. We had some judges. So we're gonna go conquest, cycles. 3 of the judges were Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. Okay? Well, after the cycles, the people kept saying, God, we want a king. And so finally, God gave them a king. So we're going to take it like we're putting our crown on. We're going to say crown. Okay? What is it? Crown. And the first 3 kings are pretty amazing because they each served for 40 years. First king was Saul. Saul started out as really a great follower of God, but he went bad fast. In fact, the Bible says Saul had no heart for God. Okay, so we're going to say crown. First king was Saul, and he had no heart. Well, the second king was a shepherd boy. Maybe you remember him that defeated Goliath and played the harp and was just a great king. His name was King David. Okay, and David is known as having a man after God's own heart. So we're going to say he had a whole heart. So we got crown. First king was Saul. He had no heart. Second king was David. He had a whole heart. The third king that reigned for 40 years was Solomon. He was David's son. He was one of the wisest men to ever live. But he also kind of fell away from God a lot and had a whole bunch of wives and he just made kind of a mess of things. And so we're going to say Solomon had a half heart. So we got the crown. First king was Saul. He had no heart. Second king was David. He had a whole heart. Third king was Solomon. He had a half heart. Okay? We've got to go all the way to there. Can we do it? Okay, let's do it. Creation, conscience, cursed, covenant, confusion, call, Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah. That brought them to Canaan. There they had children, but their children ended up carrying. There was a contest between God, Pharaoh. How many plagues? 10. But they were covered. Then they crossed, and Moses gave the commandments. How many commandments? 10. How many man to God? 4. How many man to man? 6. Right. Okay. Then they camped, and they were counted. How many tribes? 12. 2 spies were Caleb, Joshua. Moses gave the counsel. Joshua led the conquest. Then he went into cycles. There were some judges. First one was Deborah. Then there was Gideon, Samson. All right. Then there was the crown. First king was Saul. He had no heart. Second king was David. He had a whole heart. And the third king was Solomon. He had a half heart. Well, the next king was an evil king. And so he just messed things up. And it started to create division, and it split the kingdom. And what happened was the crown became a civil war. So we're going to shake the crown and then tear it apart. And we're going to say civil war. That's when a country fights against itself. It's called a civil war. The United States of America has had a civil war. So we're going to do that. Shake it and go civil war. Well, what that did was that divided the country in half. And the top half became Israel, and the bottom half became Judah. Okay? 10 of the tribes went to Israel. 2 of the tribes went to Judah. Okay? So that's what happened. And you know, when a civil war happens, what it does is it weakens a country. It's not as strong as it used to be because it's divided. And so Israel lasted for about 200 years. And then a big country named Assyria. Okay? Assyria came in and conquered Israel. In fact, it just cast them out. It threw everybody. They just came in and threw all the Israelites out. So you're going to take like you're grabbing maybe like a bag of trash. And you're going to take it and you're going to throw it. All right? And we're going to say cast out. What is it? Cast out. So we've got the crown. First king was Saul. He had no heart. Second king was David. He had a whole heart. Third king was Solomon. He had a half heart. Then there was the civil war, and Israel was cast out. Okay, so they're cast out. Well, Judah lasted about 300 years. And then this nation from over here, maybe you remember the Tower of Babylon, and the Babylonians came in. Let's get a little more red here. And they came in and they took over Judah. And instead of casting them out, they put them in captivity. So we're going to take like you're handcuffing somebody, and we're going to say captivity. So we got cast. Israel was cast out, and Judah was put into captivity. Now, it was during this time that we think of some pretty famous stories in the Bible. Maybe you'll remember some of these. While what the Babylonians did was they took a lot of the young, sharp, good Jewish Israelite kids and young people, and they took them back, and they tried to indoctrinate them into their culture and make them a part of their, and that's where we hear the story of Daniel. Remember Daniel in the lion's den and his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they built the big idol to Nebuchadnezzar, and they wouldn't bow down. and they got thrown in the fiery furnace, but God was with them, and he protected them because they followed God. And so we hear those stories of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's also where we hear the story of Queen Esther. And so the king wanted to get a new queen, and he picked one of the prettiest of all, and she was actually an Israelite from Judah, and she was Queen Esther. And when it was a moment for her to stand up for her people, she stood up to the king for such a time as this, and she stepped in and saved her people. And so even though the country was a mess and they were being attacked, God was still working and moving among those people who chose to still follow him. So it's pretty amazing. So Israel is cast out, and Judah is put into captivity. So let's do from covered. Okay. So we got covered, crossing, commandments. How many commandments? 10. How many man to God? 4. How many man to man? 6. And then they camped and they were counted. How many tribes? 12. All right. And then there was Caleb and Joshua. Moses gave the counsel. Joshua led the conquest, but then they went into cycles. There were some judges. One was Deborah. And there was Gideon and Samson, right? Then there was the crown. First king was Saul. He had no heart. Second king was David. He had a whole heart. Third king was Solomon. He had a half heart. Then there was a civil war. Assyria came in and cast Israel out. Babylon came in and put Judah into captivity. Now, there's some neat stories because a couple of guys that were caught up in all this, I'm going to give you just a letter. It was Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah. Nehemiah was working for the foreign king. Ezra was a prophet and really trying to get people back to God. And Ezra and Nehemiah made a big effort to get the people that had been cast out and put into captivity back to Israel and Jerusalem and back to following God. So Ezra was the first one. He really worked on people's hearts. And so you remember we talked about the kings, they had no heart. Well, Ezra wanted to cement the people's hearts back to God's heart. And so Ezra he found the book of the law. He found their Old Testament, the scriptures. He started reading the scriptures to the people. He did public readings for 7 days in a row so that the people would be reminded of the God who was the God of all gods. Because a lot of these other nations followed other gods and worshiped idols. He wanted to remind them of the God that had brought them out of Egypt, the God who had led them, the God who had brought them to the promised land. And so he read the Bible out loud for 7 days because he wanted to cement people's hearts. So for Ezra, we're going to take like we're making a heart back again, and we're going to say cement. And so Ezra did the cement. So Ezra was working on the people's hearts while Nehemiah realized, hey, I need to work on our land. And one of the things is the main city of Jerusalem had a wall around it, and the wall had been torn down. When there's civil war battles, cities get destroyed, and their wall had been torn down. And so Nehemiah wanted to go back and rebuild the wall. So he asked the king who he'd been working for here, the foreign king, will you give me papers so that I can travel? Will you give me wood to do it? And will you let me go home and rebuild the wall? And because Nehemiah had been faithful and a good servant to him, he let him go. And so he came back and he got people to work on every portion of the wall near their house. And so sometimes they would be attacked. So sometimes the workers have a hammer in one hand and a sword in the other. But Nehemiah helped rebuild the wall. And what's amazing is that they did it in like 52 days. 52 days. And so while Ezra was doing the cement of their hearts, Nehemiah was doing the construction. Because when you want to get a land back to where it should be, you got to get the people's hearts back to following God, and you got to physically get your land back. And so Ezra did the cement, and Nehemiah, like we got a knee, we're going to do the construction. Can you do that? Construction. So we got cement and construction, all right? So that came all back here, and the people started following God. And guess what? After that, there was 400 years of calm. No wars, no battles, no division, just 400 years of calm. So we're going to just we're kind of saying, shh, we're going to say calm. Can you do that? Calm. And after 400 years of calm, guess who came? Christ. It was time for Jesus. So then the New Testament tells us all about Jesus and the beginning of the church. And so that is part of God's epic story. But you've got to know the Old Testament first to really see what God was up to. So I hope you'll keep practicing, keep working on it. Let's do it one time really fast. Let's see if we can do fast, all right? Creation, conscience, cursed, covenant, confusion, call Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah. That brought them to Canaan. There they had children up carrying. There was a contest between who? God, Pharaoh. How many plagues? 10. But they were covered, and then they crossed. Moses gave the commandments. How many? 10. How many man to God? 4. How many man to man? 6. Right. 6. Then they camped. All right. What was the big camp? Tabernacle. Right. Then they were counted. How many tribes? 12. 2 spies. Caleb, Joshua. Moses gave counsel. Joshua led the conquest. They went to cycles. Deborah, Gideon, Samson, crown. First king was Saul, no heart. Second king was David, whole heart. Third king was Solomon, half heart. Then there was civil war. Israel was cast out. Judah was put into captivity. Ezra did the cement. Nehemiah did the construction. 400 years of calm. Christ. You guys are awesome. Always remember the Bible walk, because when you understand God's epic story, then you know who God is, you know how to follow him, and you know his whole purpose was sending Jesus to be our rescuer.